New local religions? Rastafari. Part 1. Religion as ethnic identity. Last time, we touched on some of the reasons why we see new religions as somehow different from more ancient ones, and also different from modern secular cultures. Another issue that often shocks us when we encounter new religions is when those new religions make explicit claims about ethnicity. If someone told you that they just joined a religion that you had never heard of before, and that it was exclusive to people of only one ethnic group, and not your own, you would almost certainly raise an eyebrow to this strange new faith. But again, we have to ask, why? Why would it bother you if there was a religion that was particularly concerned with only one ethnic group? Well, again, this is yet another side effect of our modern notion of religion. If religion, this specifically Protestant concept, is about belief, what one thinks and considers to be true, then culture, ethnicity, and race shouldn't matter, right? If religion is belief, the only qualifying factor should be, what do you believe? But once you strip away this rather recent way of thinking, this way called religion, you pretty quickly see that many ancient cults, customs, practices, and mythologies are really only addressing one specific ethnic group, and are sometimes openly opposed to other ethnic groups. Consciously or unconsciously, we who have this very particular understanding of religion will ignore or sometimes totally miss the centrality of ethnicity to many of the world's religions, even the ones we've studied here. For example, we saw in ancient Hinduism a very direct concern with ethnic and linguistic identity. The Vedas are specifically in Sanskrit, the language of the Arya peoples who arrived in India in the 2nd millennium BCE. Sanskrit was never, and still is not, a commonly spoken Indian language. There are hundreds of languages and dialects spoken across India, and hundreds of ancient and modern ethnic groups likewise. But one of them, the Arya, held their language and their gods in particular esteem over other gods and other languages. The fact that the top 3 castes of the Varna system are only composed of people who are ethnically Aryan shouldn't be overlooked either. We cannot honestly discuss ancient Hinduism, and to some extent modern Hinduism, without acknowledging the claim that the Vedas, the Vedic language, and the Vedic gods give preferential treatment to one ethnicity over others. The fact that a certain ethnic group was raised over others in Vedic religion is one of the major Hindu arguments against the caste system today. And over in the Mediterranean, many of the paganisms that we've met previously have direct interest in certain ethnic communities. To worship the Greek or Egyptian or Norse gods was to worship the gods of particular people who spoke particular languages and dwelt only in particular localities. While, like Hinduism, paganism could be quite porous and fluid in regards to practice, we shouldn't overlook claims that, for example, the Greek gods are local to the places where there are ethnically Greek people. We can read the belief that a god is local to a certain place pluralistically if we want. I have my gods and you have yours. But we can also correctly interpret that as a kind of bigotry. I don't care about the gods that you worship because I don't care about people who aren't like me. And yes, even the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is very interested in ethnicity in a way that can make people today uncomfortable. God has a chosen people, the ethnic community called the Judeans or the Israelites. Elohim has a special concern with one particular ethnic group. It's no wonder that the most widespread of the world's religions today often arose out of questions about how an ethnically exclusive religion relates to people in other ethnic groups. Hinduism, which remains locked eternally to the specific peoples of the subcontinent, begat Buddhism, which spread throughout Asia. Well, the breaking away from the caste system, and the Aryanness built into the caste system, was one of the most striking ways Buddhism spread around the world when Hinduism remained roughly local. And in time, Buddhists too started to frame Buddhism ethnically. Many of the distinctions between the Theravada, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana streams of Buddhism are as much about ethnic and linguistic exclusivity as about the specifics of practice or interpretation. And from the foundations of Christianity, there was the question of the Council of Jerusalem, about whether or not one had to practice the Judean religion and culture in order to join up with the Jesus movement. And although most Christians would answer, no, Christianity is not exclusive to Jews, many forms of pre-modern Christianity prioritize ethnic identity. Catholicism was for long centuries interlocked with the people of the Latin-speaking Roman West. And Orthodox Christianity still identifies itself with ethnic groups even today. There's a Greek Orthodox Church, and a Russian Orthodox Church, and an Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and so on. And even modern Christians, like Protestants, insist that the Bible must be available in their own language, and repeatedly depict Jesus as a member of their own ethnic group, not others. And Islam too wrestled with whether and how ethnicity played into its mission. While the contents of the Quran did not claim to give pride of place to one ethnic group over others, in the 7th century, when the Quran first appeared, only Arabs spoke Arabic. And sure enough, Arabs make up less than 15% of Muslims on Earth today. But there's still been a long history of Arab centrism in many Islamic circles. God may be speaking to all people, but he's only using the language of one. But after the rise of the modern period, and after the category of religion was introduced as a kind of thought or belief in particular claims, people could choose, if they wanted to overlook the ethnic dimensions of the world's religions. See, it's really about what you think, not about the group that you were born into. So let's see what happens when a new religion emerges in the modern period that, like many of the ancient religions, is concerned with one group of people most especially. Does it seem different? Or does it just seem new? Part 2. The Afro-Jamaican origins of the Rastafari. Rastafari, or Rastafarianism, is found across the world, with sizable populations in the Caribbean, North America, Europe, and New Zealand. But it appeared first and most substantially in Jamaica. Rastafari developed out of Jamaica's long history of being colonized. First, Spain controlled Jamaica until 1655, and then the British held the island until 1962. A major part of that colonization process was the introduction of African slaves, and to this day, the majority of Jamaicans are the descendants of those enslaved peoples of West Africa. Like slaves everywhere that Europeans colonized, the Afro-Jamaican peoples had their ancestral African cultures, languages, and religions torn away from them, both by bodily violence and by more subtle but long-lasting psychological violence. In other words, not only did the Afro-Jamaican slave have to deal with the immediate pains of physical enslavement, forced labor, the loss of bodily autonomy, especially sexual autonomy, and being subject to random punishment and relocation, The enslaved African in Jamaica was subjected to the problems of internalized slavery, living under a worldview, religion, and political system designed specifically to subjugate you. Most significantly, this included, but was not limited to, the American and European construct called race. Race, as we know it now, was introduced in the modern period to explain and justify the slave trade by categorizing vast and often rather arbitrary groups of people as either black or white. While people from time immemorial had occasionally used colors like black or white to describe appearance, these historically have not been employed in any systematic way by anyone anywhere. While a person with lighter skin from Northern Europe, Central Asia, Greater Syria, or Persia might sometimes be described as white, or someone from Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Egypt, Ethiopia, or Yemen might be referred to as black, these were not identities. It was just a description, like referring to a certain ethnic group as being notably tall or wide-chested. There was no pre-modern conception of whiteness or blackness, which cut across many different ethnic groups. Likewise, before the modern period, there was no widespread notion of Africanness or Europeanness, which we today use as bywords for racial identity. Someone from medieval Ireland would not think of herself as having some racial identity in common with the Scandinavians, the Spanish, and the Anatolians. And likewise, someone from medieval Ashanti, modern Ghana, wouldn't consider herself as somehow racially linked to Moroccans, Egyptians, and Zimbabweans. Africanness and Europeanness are entirely modern and do not appear until the colonial period. The introduction of blackness, whiteness, Africanness, and Europeanness does not affect everyone the same way. First, the colors black and white are invariably linked with morality. In the Western imagination, and particularly the Christian and Islamic imagination, blackness or darkness is symbolically linked to evil, while whiteness or lightness is symbolically linked to goodness and purity. So, to refer to one race as black and the other as white carries an overt judgment about the quality of the people being discussed. Second, the imposition of race was a powerful way to erase more meaningful identities. And again, this erasure of more ancient forms of identity didn't play out the same way on everyone. For a European, or a white person, during the colonial age, these were the colonizers. The categories of Europeanness and whiteness were only used comparatively. Because the people from Europe who moved around the world during the colonial period were usually doing so willingly, they were free to retain their ancestral identities of religion, nation, ethnic group, or language. They could self-identify as Lutheran, French, Catholic, German, Jewish, or British, following the customs of their respective groups and personal preferences wherever they went. But for enslaved peoples, their ancestral identities of ethnicity, language, religion, and homeland were forcibly wiped away. The slaves of the colonial period could not use their own languages. They were usually converted to the given Christianity of their masters, and centuries of forced intermarriage, rape, and relocation made it impossible for most slaves to even clearly identify their ethnic origins. The enslaved peoples were increasingly stuck with the racial identities of either blackness or Africanness, categories that were at once vague and foreign to their ancestors' indigenous ways of identifying themselves. That started to change as the colonial world order of the European empires started to break down in the early 20th century. In the case of Jamaica specifically, we start to see the appearance of people like Marcus Garvey. Garvey was repulsed not only by the economic servitude of Afro-Jamaicans to white people, but by the psychological servitude to whiteness. People of African descent in Jamaica, the United States, and everywhere else should reject the culture of whiteness and Europeanness, with the residual history of slavery incumbent in both. But as the overwhelming majority of enslaved peoples and their living descendants had no meaningful link to the African cultures that they had once been torn away from, assuming that such a culture could even be identified, they had to turn to the only identities still available: blackness and Africanness. Garvey was therefore the foundational figure of Pan-Africanism, the argument that the peoples of Africa and the African diaspora, that is, peoples who were enslaved, have a shared identity, a shared destiny, and a shared common interest. Nearly all of the people who remained in Africa now lived in national units that were either heavily manipulated by colonial powers or were still colonies. Meanwhile, the people stolen from Africa in chains had their own identities radically transformed by the violence of colonization in another, but not unrelated way. So, all of the people of Africa and the survivors of the Atlantic slave trade shared a common problem, which Garvey and other Pan-Africanists claimed they could only solve collectively. In 1914, Garvey created the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, whose stated goals are to foster the study of the often suppressed African histories and cultures. The UNIA is founded by persons desiring to do the utmost to work for the general uplift of the people of African ancestry of the world. And the members pledge themselves to do all in their power to conserve the rights of their noble race and to respect the rights of all mankind, believing always in the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. The motto of the organization is one God, one aim, one destiny. Therefore, let justice be done to all mankind, realizing that if the strong oppresses the weak, confusion and discontent will ever mark the path of man. But with love, faith, and charity towards all, the reign of peace and plenty will be heralded into the world, and the generations of men shall be called blessed. Notice here in the UNIA's foundational preamble the explicitly religious character to this call for Pan-Africanness. The UNIA, and Garvey specifically, spoke in a prophetic language about Africanness. Like many people of the African diaspora, Garvey saw scriptural precedent in the present situation. Consider the story of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt. There, a people were kept away from their ancestral homeland in a state of slavery, but God remembered this people and made it possible for them to return home again. Likewise, the story of the Babylonian captivity repeated these themes of exile, bondage, and the longing for the lost Jerusalem. Garvey and many others drew powerful parallels between these biblical events and modern colonialism. Babylon would become just another way of saying the state of diaspora, now referring to the physical and psychological captivity of Africans, while Jerusalem, or Zion, referred to the state of returning both to a literal homeland, in this case Africa, and the spiritual state of proximity to God. And, like how both the Exodus and Babylonian captivity stories in the Bible culminated in the arrival of powerful leaders like Moses, who would guide his people home, or Cyrus, who ended the Babylonian captivity, Garvey saw the need for an African leader who would bring the far-flung children of Africa back to freedom and back home again. Garvey told the people of the African diaspora to await the coming of a native African king who was subject to no outside colonial power. Look to Africa, when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is at hand. And many saw such a king in the form of the new emperor of Ethiopia, who ascended to power in 1930. He was born a nobleman, a Raz, Gaiz for prince or duke, named Lij Teferi, so Raz Teferi. Upon his ascension to the imperial throne of Ethiopia, Ras Teferi took the title of Emperor Haile Selassie I. And this name was more than just a royal title, it was a religious designation. Haile Selassie literally means Holy Trinity, a direct nod to the emperor's own Ethiopian Christian heritage. Even before Haile Selassie came to power, many peoples of the African diaspora, and in Jamaica specifically, saw Ethiopia as an especially remarkable place. Not only was it an influential African nation, it was an African power that had successfully avoided European colonization, a rare feat. Haile Selassie himself had even been a key player in the expulsion of Italian forces that tried to seize the country in the 1930s. And not only that, there was again a religious sentiment to this Afro-Jamaican adoration of Ethiopia. Even in the ancient world, the rulers of Ethiopia had been considered the descendants of the biblical King Solomon and the powerful Queen of Sheba. And the presence of the distinctly Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, seemed to strengthen this connection of Ethiopia to Israel even before the rise of Christianity. And so, the Jamaican Christians of the 20th century could see this new emperor as a champion of African anti-colonialism and as a ruler from the house of David through his son Solomon. Taking Marcus Garvey's predictions of a divinely appointed African king to heart, many Jamaicans welcomed the arrival of Haile Selassie with more than just political adoration. Stories circulated that Haile Selassie would send ships to bring displaced Africans home again, or that his arrival heralded a new age of African unity, and many viewed this through the Jewish and Christian lenses of salvation history. Haile Selassie was a messianic king, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, using the biblical parlance, or that he was the Messiah, an anointed king of the line of David, or further even, that he was Jesus as the second coming, or even that he was, like Jesus, an incarnation of God, the biblical Jehovah, or Jah. Haile Selassie himself, a very devout member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, never accepted such a divinization. But he didn't deny the spirit of these Rastafari, worshippers of Rastafari. He too shared the Pan-African spirit of the return to one's proper homeland. In 1938, he even created the Ethiopian World Federation and granted land in Ethiopia to anyone of African descent anywhere in the world who wanted to settle it. And in 1966, Haile Selassie traveled to Jamaica himself and received a massive welcome from these Rastafarians. The adoration of this Ethiopian emperor did not even stop with his death in 1975. The Rastafari argued that he had merely shucked off his physical body, and that he is still alive somehow in spiritual form. Part 3. The Many Mansions of the Rastafari. There are about 4 million people in the world today who identify as Rastas or Rastafari. But the religion is not, and does not claim to be, a unified body. There are many movements and branches within Rastafarianism, which interpret their tradition without any authoritative figures or councils. While there are certain individuals who are considered elders, No one claims or is accepted as a universal authority the way, say, a clergy would be. Actually, Rastas are actively accepting of internal diversity within their community. They'll refer to the mansions of Rastafari, echoing the teachings of Jesus in John 14, that in my Father's house are many mansions. They take this to mean that plurality is not opposed to Rastafarian unity. Each possible reading and interpretation of the religion is just one more of these many mansions. The diversity of the mansions of Rastafari aside, though, there are some general notions of Rastafarian orthodoxy. They are Trinitarian monotheists, although they would not normally think of themselves as Christians. And unlike most forms of Christianity, Rastafarians make no claim to any institutional body, so there's no official interpretation of what Trinity means or how it is to be interpreted. Likewise, all Rastas would agree that Haile Selassie is somehow a salvific figure of this Trinitarian God. But how that works, how he is divine, and in what capacity is open to a bit of interpretation. Further, all Rastafari would affirm the divine origins of the Bible, but they would also add that it has a specific, often hidden message for the people of the African diaspora. So take this passage from Psalm 68. Envoys will come out of Egypt. Ethiopia will quickly stretch out her hands to God. Sing to God, you kingdoms of the earth. Oh, sing praises to the Lord, Selah. Remember that there's a well-known comparison between the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt and the enslavement of Africans in the colonial period. When this psalm is looked at with this hermeneutic in mind, it seems to say that in your state of enslavement and captivity in Egypt, Ethiopia will offer proper praise to God, and through Ethiopia, all the nations of the earth will praise God likewise. Now, a big question here is the role of race, blackness, or Africanness in Rastafarianism. And like with all other issues of Rastafari thought, there's no one to make singular authoritative claims on behalf of the whole community. What is clear, though, is that there is a strong parallel between the modern people of African descent and the ancient people of Israel. How that parallel works is up for grabs. In some Rastafarian circles, there's a parallel between the Israelites and the people of African origins because they're the same people. The collective peoples of Africa and the African diaspora are the descendants of the ancient Israelites, replaying the exilic history of biblical times in the colonial and post-colonial world. In that case, Babylon, the land of exile, is the culture and civilization of the foreigner, the white colonial world. While in other Rastafarian readings of history, the peoples of African descent are parallel to the Israelites through shared experience. Both are peoples chosen by God and who struggle to return to Zion, or Jerusalem, spiritually, if not always literally. Or, a Rastafarian could think that the elect people of God are peoples in bondage in any sense of the term, literal or spiritual exile. In that case, a Rasta doesn't need to be a person of African descent herself. So in this regard, a white European or a Maori New Zealander can also become a Rastafari. And as Rastafarianism is open-ended in belief, it's also open-ended in practice. The most universal practice is referred to as grounding, or in some mansions, assemblies. Grounding can take on many forms, and some take place over several days, but they usually begin and end with the reciting of scriptural passages, or more specifically Rastafarian hymns. During the grounding, there's going to be drumming or singing. The musical beats of these groundings would later inspire the famous reggae music of people like Jimmy Cliff and Bob Marley, who spread Rastafarianism beyond Jamaica in the 1960s and 70s. The music of the grounding is followed by spiritual discussions called reasoning, in which theology and scripture are discussed or debated amongst the community. During these groundings, many Rastafari ritually smoke, eat, or drink marijuana or ganja as a spiritual aid to increase inner peace, while other Rastafari reject the use of it or any intoxicant. Some Rastas would be opposed to the use of marijuana recreationally outside of the grounding ritual, but there's difference of opinion there too. Similarly, other arenas of Rastafarian practice are open to personal and regional interpretation. For instance, the use of language amongst Rastas is of spiritual importance. In one sense, the language of European imperial rulers can be seen as deeply problematic. And so, English specifically is often deliberately represented using vocabulary and grammar specific to Rastafarians. This is referred to as dread talk, with dread in the sense of serious and righteous. Of note in dread talk is the replacement of the accusative pronoun me with the nominative I. Since talking about me treats the self as an object to be acted upon, like when you say to me or for me, playing up the use of I highlights people's more subjective functions. Further, this use of I also underscores the divine self in each human being, as the biblical God often speaks in the first person this way. So, a Rastafarian may even refer to themselves as I and I, meaning the person standing before you, and the divine presence within that person. The most famous word from Aaric or dread talk is dreadlocks, and many, but of course not all, Rastafari wear their hair in this style. And again, we can see in this fashion both anti-colonial thought and biblical precedent. Since European white customs often dictate what is considered attractive or respectable, wearing one's hair in a way that is explicitly not white or European can be considered an act of personal liberation. And at the same time, there is repeated biblical warnings that men specifically should keep their hair long or even avoid cutting it entirely. And Rastas who wear dreadlocks often interpret it as a kind of covenant with God, a symbol of long-lasting public devotion, as dreadlocks are more or less permanent unless they're cut off. And again, pulling from the rejection of colonialism and simultaneously from the affirmation of biblical injunctions, Rastafarians tend to follow dietary restrictions of some kind or another. Artificially produced or preserved foods are often avoided, in moving away from colonial, especially British diets, while keeping in line with biblical halakhic diet, so shellfish and pork are usually not eaten. And merging these two thoughts together, many Rastas will become strict vegetarians as well. Here are some things to think about. How does ethnicity play into the world's religions? And why do we often overlook it? How did Rastafari develop? What are some of the beliefs and practices of the Rastafari?